For years, our organic co-op in Portsmouth, New Hampshire had a star supplier, an odd farmer named Carl, whose mushroom farm sat just off I-95 in Down East Maine. People came from all over to buy his mushrooms, from nearby towns and even as far south as Boston. They weren't just good, they were unforgettable. Earthy and deeply aromatic with a flavor profile that seemed impossible. Chefs would line up on Fridays to buy his wild morels, black trumpets, and lobster mushrooms, delicacies that usually required a hike into remote wild corners of Maine. But somehow, Carl grew them all effortlessly on his little farm, year-round, producing what seemed like endless quantities. But Carl himself was strange. He had this way of staring emotionless whenever I inspected the weekly deliveries. His face was pinched, and he rarely spoke more than a few words. His eyes were a glassy, stormy gray, always slightly wide, as if he were listening to something just out of reach. He never spoke about his farm, never mentioned anyone working for him, and was always alone. His clothes looked stained and aged, patched here and there with what looked like pieces of burlap, and he never, ever removed his gloves. They were thick and worn, blackened with who knew what, and he always smelled faintly of mildew. As the months went by, I noticed strange things. First, he began delivering at night, showing up long after we'd closed, leaving his boxes of mushrooms outside with a handwritten note. His handwriting was jagged and large, but he always drew a detailed sketch of the types of mushrooms he delivered. It was like all his energy and care went into those notes and the drawings that accompanied them. Even his payments started piling up. I tried sending them to the farm address, but they were returned as undeliverable. Carl was definitely an odd person. Over the years, the missing person reports became more numerous in Maine. They became more frequent, all along the stretch of I-95 near his farm. It wasn't just tourists or travelers. Locals began disappearing too. People I'd see regularly at the co-op. A woman who'd often ask about our fresh produce, a father and a son who once came in for local honey. One by one, they vanished without a trace. Some rumors started circulating about strange sightings near Carl's land, whispers of ghostly figures or strange noises echoing from that stretch of highway. People started taking alternate routes across the state. It was getting that bad. One afternoon, I was visiting with a friend just north of Portland, and I realized I could head a little farther north to drop off Carl's checks and maybe sneak a peek at the strange guy's mushroom farm. I was genuinely intrigued by how this peculiar guy was such a master at growing the best mushrooms around. As I reached his property, the sun was setting and a late summer rain began pouring down. His property was fenced with warped, rusting wire, and beyond it his land sprawled wide and dark. The soil was unlike anything I'd seen, rich, black, and damp with a sweet, sickly smell of rich organic matter. As I reached the dark main building, flashlight in hand, I spotted something protruding from the ground. A thin, weathered bracelet, the type you'd see on hikers. As I moved the beam of my flashlight down to the earth, I froze, a sickening realization dawning on me. There were scattered remnants of personal items poking through the soil, a keyring, a muddy scarf, and the sole of a boot. And then I saw them, his rows and rows of mushroom beds. But these weren't any mushroom-growing logs I recognized. They were twisted, pale and bloated, unnatural shapes unlike anything found in the wild. The earth around them seemed disturbed, mounded in uneven patches. As I was about to turn and run, I heard a sound, a dragging, scraping noise. Carl was there, just a few yards away, dragging a tarp-wrapped bundle toward an empty plot in the field. My flashlight slipped, clattering to the ground, and his head snapped up, those pale eyes locking onto mine with a look of calm, icy certainty. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping as I turned and bolted to my car. I called the police on my way back to Portsmouth. They searched Carl's property and uncovered one of the most horrifying discoveries in the state's history. In the freshly dug earth beneath his mushroom beds, they found remains, fragments of over 38 people, meticulously buried, each plot serving as fertile ground for his delicious mushrooms. Carl was taken into custody, but even in jail, his pale, glassy eyes looked somewhere far away. The co-op shuttered soon after when the chefs, the foodies, when everyone stopped coming, when they stopped asking about the mushrooms, because everyone knew what they'd been eating. From the beginning, something about him felt off. I was 7 when my mom brought Tom into our lives. She called him handsome. He was neatly dressed with an easy smile and seemed to melt everyone that met him. But to me, his gaze was hollow. That day in the kitchen, the first time we met, he looked down at me, smiled, and extended a hand, cold, firm, and calculated. I shook it, but only because my mom was watching. As I got older, Tom became a fixture in our home. He'd take my mom out to dinner every Friday, come over to fix leaky faucets and buy flowers that he'd put in vases around the house. He was considerate and thoughtful, she said. He even remembered my birthday every year, always gifting me these expensive, elaborate toys I'd never even asked for. But beneath the generosity, there was something unsettling, something I could never put my finger on. My mother always talked about his blue eyes, but to me, they were empty and never quite agreed with his smile. Tom was obsessed with cleanliness. He'd pull out a crisp white handkerchief whenever he had to touch a public door handle, and he'd wash his hands before, during, and after he cooked or fixed anything around the house. He also had a peculiar rule about shoes. He never wore them indoors and wouldn't let my mom or me wear them around him either. Once, when I came in from the rain without taking my shoes off, he squared off to me so intently, approaching with such fury, until Mom turned around and interrupted. He took his restrained fury into the living room, but I quickly pulled off my shoes and wiped down the floor. I don't know what would have happened if she hadn't been there. They were on and off for years. They would argue and he'd disappear for a while, but then she'd take him back. Once I walked in on him when he had her pushed against the wall, towering over her. He dropped his grip on her neck when he heard the door close behind me, and then stormed past me. After that day, he wasn't back for months. As I got older, I noticed more oddities. Tom had a way of just showing up. If I was playing out in the neighborhood, he'd be leaning against the lamppost or watching from his car, always with a calm, unreadable look. He'd wave, that same forced smile stretching across his face. At first, I told myself he was just keeping an eye on me, but it didn't take long to realize he never waved at anyone else's kids. But what haunted me most were his stories. They were odd, twisted things he'd tell me when Mom wasn't around, always tainted with darkness. He'd describe abandoned houses in eerie detail, talking about how the wood in the floors would rot, how animals would make nests in forgotten basements. Once he even told me about a ravine where he said you'd never find a person again if they knew how to disappear right. I was 14 when I found the first clue, a small slip of paper in the back of his car. It looked like a parking ticket, but it was from a town hours away, somewhere neither my mom nor I had ever visited with him. I showed it to her, but she brushed it off, saying Tom had likely driven through on business. But what business was that? He never seemed to have a job. He was always available, always there, hovering in the background like a shadow you couldn't shake. One night, when I couldn't sleep, I went downstairs for a glass of water. By the dim light from the hallway, I saw Tom sitting alone in the dark living room, hunched over his phone, scrolling through photos. Something about the way he held the phone, reverently, almost affectionately, made me uneasy. From my angle on the stairs, I could see there were pictures of women, all unfamiliar. Some of them looked scared, while others stared blankly, like they didn't even know their photos were being taken. I felt a wave of nausea as I stood frozen on those stairs. Somehow he seemed to sense that I was watching. His head snapped up, and he looked right at me, his face void of that usual practiced warmth. His eyes were wide, and for a split second, his expression was pure, raw hatred. Then it was gone, replaced by that plastic smile. I bolted up the stairs and I lay awake, shaking. I told my mom the next morning, my voice barely a whisper, hoping she'd believe me. She frowned, her expression distant. But then she sighed. "Oh, honey, Tom would never hurt us. He loves us." I watched her face as she spoke, and I saw it. A sliver of doubt, the tired indecision she tried to mask. But she stayed with him, ignoring the whispers in both of our heads. It was a year later, when I was 16, that I found the second clue. I'd come home from school early, and I found the garage door slightly open. Tom was inside scrubbing the trunk of his car, and he hadn't heard me approach. As I peered in, I saw thick black trash bags, duct tape, and a collection of knives laid out on a tarp. He turned around, his face blank for a split second before he plastered on his usual friendly smile. "Just cleaning up," he said casually, rolling up the tarp as if he hadn't just revealed too much. I never confronted him, and I never told my mom. Instead, I began keeping my distance, always listening for his footsteps, watching the way he'd lock his gaze on me whenever we were alone. My mom started working longer hours, leaving me with Tom more often. I avoided the house when I knew I'd be alone with him, and never let him drive me anywhere. If I was caught alone with him, I'd stay in my bedroom with the door locked, waiting for him to show his true nature. But he never did. He'd occasionally cook us dinner, acting like a father figure, but all the while, I felt his eyes on me, with something that looked close to hunger. The final night came one cold November evening when the news broke. A neighbor's daughter had gone missing. The search parties were out in full force, and the neighborhood was buzzing. My mom was frantic, joining the other neighbors, offering food and support. I stayed back, heart pounding. That night, when others searched, I slipped out and walked to the spot where Tom's car was parked down the street, hidden away. I pressed my hand against the hood. It was still warm. My stomach lurched. That evening, when he came home, he looked at me with a strange softness, or disappointment, almost as if he were saying goodbye. My mom, distracted by worry, didn't notice, but I saw it. The look of a man who'd gotten away with too much, or not enough. That was the last time we saw him. A month after he disappeared, my mom found one last gift he'd left behind when she was cleaning out her dresser. A scrap of paper that looked torn from a notebook. It was wrinkled and wedged into the drawer slide. It was a note scribbled alongside a drawing of me as I slept. It read simply, "She's not perfect yet. Waiting makes me stronger." In the years that followed, I'd heard about him on the news sometimes. Tom, the quote, kind man neighbors remembered, who'd go on to be wanted in connection with a series of disappearances. They never did catch him, and though my mom and I tried to forget, the weight of what we'd lived with lingered. I'd sometimes feel like I was being watched, like he was nearby, and I prepared myself for what I'd do if he appeared in front of me one day. Some nights, even now, so many years later, I wake up to the memory of his voice, sure I'd heard him here in the waking world, calling softly to me in the darkness of my room. I hated that he made me lose something of myself, damaged my safety without laying a hand on me. When I lay there, listening in the darkness, I remember my years of physical conditioning and marksmanship, and I hear my Malinois breathing softly asleep beside me. I know I'm ready. I had become perfect. Like I said, they never did catch him. Like I said, they never did find him. I'd stopped at that rest stop off the highway in Virginia dozens of times. As a regional manager for a men's clothing chain, my job took me up and down the state, and looking presentable was part of my job. It was a good halfway point, clean enough bathrooms, reasonable privacy, and the comfort of routine. Nothing about it ever stood out, until the day I found the first drawing. It was taped to the mirror in the men's room, a small piece of paper with thick, rough strokes, depicting a crude outline of the rest stop itself. A handful of cars were sketched into the tiny parking lot, one of which looked strangely familiar. I leaned closer, feeling a chill run up my spine. It was my car, down to the scuff on the bumper and a luggage rack I'd just installed the year before. The artist, whoever they were, had gotten the details just right. Shrugging it off as some strange prank, I left it there and drove on, convincing myself that some weirdo was just killing time in a very specific way. But 2 weeks later, I was back, and that day was just bad all around. I'd overslept, got stuck in traffic, and barely had time to clean myself up before my next stop. When I pulled into the same rest stop, I had this nagging feeling of déjà vu. I went into the bathroom, and there it was, another drawing, taped to the same mirror. This time it was larger and more detailed. My car was in it again, but now there was an outline of a person in the driver's seat, drawn with sharp lines, almost violently scribbled into the page. I could tell it was supposed to be me. And behind me, barely visible in the back seat, there was a shadow, a vague shape that I couldn't make out, almost as if it was unfinished. I tore the drawing off the mirror, stuffed it into the trash, and told myself that was the last time I was going to use that rest stop. But 3 days later, on my way back from a meeting, I was hit with a wave of exhaustion. Against my better judgment, I pulled off the highway and into the same place. This time, the restroom was eerily quiet. There was a smell, too, something faint but rotten, like mildew and sweat. I held my breath and looked around, feeling a prickling sense of dread. I almost turned and left, but curiosity got the best of me. Taped to the wall above the sink was another drawing. I felt my stomach lurch as I stepped closer. This one was darker, drawn with angry streaks and frantic scratches. It showed me, but not in my car this time. I was on the ground near the rest stop entrance, my body twisted unnaturally, my face frozen in a look of terror. Blood, just jagged red lines in the ink, pooled around me. And again there was the shadow standing over my body, like it was enjoying my pain. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself I'd never go back, no matter what. Yet, 2 weeks later, it was like my car had a mind of its own, pulling me into that cursed rest stop. I remember standing there, gripping the door of my car, telling myself to just turn around and drive off. But it was late, and I knew there wouldn't be another place to stop for at least another 45 minutes. Admittedly, the horrible need to see drew me back into that bathroom. I scanned the parking lot and saw mine was the only car. There was nobody here, I told myself. It would be fine. But when I walked in, my heart stopped. Every wall was covered in drawings, all of them showing me, terrified, shocked, or in pain. In one, I was screaming as that shadowy figure loomed over me, reaching out with long, clawed hands. In another, I was lying on the bathroom floor, eyes wide and empty. Each sketch seemed to move, almost alive in the dim light, the images etched with frenzied, hateful strokes. I turned, desperate to escape, but there, taped to the back of the door, was the last drawing, the worst of them all. It showed the shadow looming over me on the ground, crouched like a predator ripping at my neck, savoring the kill. I tore that paper down, and as I did, I felt the air grow thick and cold, and heard the echoing sound of a metallic click as one of the stall doors unlocked. For a second, I stood frozen, unable to breathe, my hand still clutching the drawing. I didn't dare look. I stumbled out, ran to my car, and sped off without looking back. I never used that rest stop again, but every so often I'll find a slip of paper tucked under my windshield wiper, and my heart stops. They're drawings, always of me, with my face twisted in terror. Sometimes it's just the shadow lurking behind me. Each time, the drawings are more vivid, showing detail of my own home. It's as if the artist is getting closer. The vet clinic always had an air about it, a heaviness that clung to the dim corridors and settled in the corners of rooms, as if it had absorbed years of pain, anxiety, and death. On weekends, when the usual bustle of vet techs, assistants, and clients had died down, that eerie atmosphere thickened, almost like it was watching you. In a place where I'd been told to expect odd sounds and movements, where whispers of bad energy floated around among the staff, I had my own reasons for keeping to myself. It was past midnight, and I'd been alone. This particular Saturday was quieter than usual. It was my last weekend shift, as I'd already put in my 2 weeks' notice. John, the kennel tech, had left early after a family emergency, and with the animals tucked away and medicated, I figured I'd do one last sweep. The last thing on my list was to check in on Rosie, a sweet elderly shepherd mix recovering from a nasty bout of pancreatitis. She lay curled up on her cot, her breathing even and steady. I gave her the IV meds, ruffling her graying fur as she lifted a tired gaze to me, grateful but weary. I didn't want to linger, though. Something about the shadows in this place seemed to stretch and pull when you weren't looking directly at them, like they had a life of their own. I'd almost made it out when I realized I'd left my backpack in the small room off the kennels where I'd been preparing Rosie's meds. With a sigh, I turned back, flicking on the lights one by one as I walked down the hallway. They buzzed to life, casting a sterile, sickly yellow glow that barely penetrated the creeping darkness pooling into the hall's corners. As I reached the kennel room, the thought hit me that this would be the last time I'd have to be in this place, alone in the building's deep, quiet belly. A strange relief washed over me with that thought. Bag in hand, I turned to leave, flicking the lights off as I went. It was a habit. The owner didn't want to pay for lights on when nobody was there. But as each switch plunged the rooms back into darkness, I felt it. The weight of something waiting there and watching me. I felt it first as a prickling across the back of my neck, that sense of being too alone in a place where there was something. I tried to ignore it, pushing through to reach the hall leading to the exit. Then I saw it. A flash of movement in the shadows just beyond the flickering lights. My stomach twisted as the figure came into focus, or almost did. It was like it didn't fully exist in this world. A small, hunched shape, blacker than black, its wings folded against its back. Its head turned toward me slowly, two glimmering, needle-thin eyes piercing through the darkness. The creature was like a monkey, but twisted, unnatural. Its skin looked tar-like, oozing, yet holding its shape as it crouched there, twitching. I'd heard about it before. Rumors whispered among staff about the impish beast that would dart under the tables or through open doorways only to vanish into the walls. No one ever spoke of it in detail, like some silent pact, each of us too afraid to acknowledge this thing's existence. The kennel's lights flickered again, and the creature's gaze was fixed, unblinking, and unwavering. I broke into a run, my steps echoing down the hallway, each stride filled with the sickening realization that I was alone, truly alone in this cursed building of cages and cold steel tables, with that thing. Shadows closed in, my breathing was fast, and my vision blurred in a dimness as I reached for each light switch, with trembling fingers practically slapping them in panic. The lights were on again, but now everything felt wrong, tainted by the thing's lingering presence. Then I heard it, the soft click of claws against the linoleum. At first I thought maybe Rosie had gotten loose, my mind trying to rationalize the impossible. But when I turned around, the hallway was empty, completely silent, until the clicks started again, closer this time. My heart thundered as I swung around, backpedaling until I was pressed against the wall, each second stretching into an eternity as the claws dragged closer, rhythmic and relentless. Then, without warning, they stopped, just beside me. Silence was worse. It was a waiting silence, a silence so deep it made my ears ring. I took a step, another, and then the thing's breath, hot, rank, and close, washed over me from the dark. I forced myself to keep walking, not daring to turn around until I reached the very last hallway that led to the exit. It was there, In the doorway that I saw the flicker of its shadow again. The shape shifted and writhed like it was made of something old and rotted that could barely contain itself. As I finally turned the corner toward the exit, the lights flickered off on their own. One by one, the overheads died until I was left in complete, smothering darkness. Behind me, from somewhere deep in the black, I heard it. A high rasp of skittering echoing down the hall. I slammed the door open and heard it crash behind me. I never went back into that clinic. Curiosity has always been my vice. And with a front row seat through my own Ring camera, my neighborhood was my own live reality show, and I couldn't resist. There was the couple 3 doors down who thought no one noticed them digging up tulips from other yards under the cover of night, and then transplanting them neatly into their own flower beds. The woman on the corner who blessed her car every morning, her hand gripping a rosary, as if she were asking for divine protection just to back out of her driveway. But it was my next-door neighbor, Mark, who was the real enigma. Unlike the others, he didn't do anything outright strange. He was polite, unassuming, the type of guy who waved when he saw you but kept to himself. It was the people who visited him that caught my attention. It was the same routine every time. Between 2 and 3 nights a week, just after dusk, 6 or 7 cars would line the curb. People dressed all in black would shuffle up his walkway, slipping silently into his house. The parties themselves were odd for their quietness. No loud music, no laughter echoing into the night. Nobody even in the backyard. I checked. By dawn, they'd be gone, as if they'd never been there at all. One night, I couldn't resist anymore. I needed to know what was going on. I thought of it as a harmless look, something to satisfy my curiosity. I crept around the back of the house, my footsteps as silent as possible in the dewy grass. The house was dark, but the faintest flicker of a dim red light seeped from his basement window. Crouching low, I peered through the window. The basement was filled with people, all seated in a wide circle, facing an enormous dark figure draped in black cloth, positioned on a raised platform in the center of the room. My heart pounded as I strained to see what was happening. The figure on the platform looked wrong. It was a mannequin, maybe, at first glance, but the skin was leathery, almost human in its texture, hanging loosely on its frame. Its head, covered by some sort of mask or helmet, was slumped forward, the way a marionette would after its strings had been cut. Just as I was about to pull away, one of the seated guests stood up and began to speak, their voice low, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. Then all at once the others joined in, repeating the words in a slow, monotonous rhythm. It became more distinct as their voices grew louder, filling the basement with a hum that seeped through the walls. I couldn't look away. The chant grew to a fever pitch, and then one of them stepped forward, pulling a dagger from their robe. With a swift motion, they slit their palm, holding their hand over a stone bowl beneath the mannequin. Thick, dark liquid dripped from their hand into the bowl, and then one by one, each person followed, bleeding into the bowl until it was nearly brimming with the stuff. Then Mark stepped forward. He lifted the bowl, raising it toward the mannequin, and poured the thick red liquid over its head. It soaked into the dark fabric, staining it, and then something moved. Just a flicker, a slight twitch of one of the mannequin's hands. I choked back a scream as I watched the mannequin's chest rise, as if drawing a breath. The thing on the platform raised its head, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt it was looking right at me. Its head turned slightly, a tilt that demonstrated a strange, malicious awareness. I was caught. I knew I had to get out of there, but I was paralyzed, caught in that gaze of something that was very much alive, something old and dangerous. Then, as suddenly as it had looked at me, the figure slumped forward again, motionless. The others acted as if nothing had happened. They simply rose, wiped their hands, and one by one filed back up the stairs, all in silence, leaving the thing in the middle of the room. Mark was the last to leave, but just before he flipped off the basement light, he looked directly at the window where I was crouched and met my eyes. He smiled, a cold, knowing smile that sent a chill through me, and then the light went out. I stumbled backward, my pulse roaring in my ears, tripping over myself as I hurried back to my house. I locked every door, every window, and turned off my lights, waiting, expecting that at any moment I'd see Mark's face in my window, or worse. I was panicking, trying to understand what I'd seen and if I should call the police. What if it was all an act or something else, something I couldn't explain? I decided to wait. For the next few nights, there were no more gatherings, no cars lining the street. The house was dark and silent. And then one night, just as I was starting to feel safe again, there was a knock at my door. I didn't answer. I couldn't. But through the peephole, I saw Mark standing there, holding something large and dark in his hands. It was a mannequin head, masked and ancient-looking, its hollow eye sockets turned right toward me, as if seeing straight into my soul. The eyes that had looked straight at me were missing. He waited a moment, then turned and walked away, leaving the head on my doorstep like a gift. I checked my camera to be sure he was back inside his house, and finally got the courage to open the door. The head was a mannequin with missing eyes, blinded by someone who'd left their sockets jagged and sharp. I never waved at Mark again, but he waved at me, cheerfully, as though nothing had happened. I don't leave my house when the cars park along our street and the people dressed in black go into his house. I know the mannequin head he delivered was not what I saw in that basement that night. They had brought something to life, or worse, had ended someone's life. But I wasn't meant to see, and I wasn't gonna go look. I turned my ring away from their house and kept it to myself. That mannequin head was his message to me. Mark moved out of that house eventually, and a new family with a kid lived there now, in that same house where weird things were happening. How do I know? Because I have a clear view of their house from my camera. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more weekly stories. If there are topics you'd like me to cover or stories you'd like to submit for me to read, please leave a comment and send them to my email address in the description. If you'd like to support my work, please give me a like, comment, and definitely share these stories with your friends. It really helps. You can also do some shopping at the Lady Grimm store. There's a link here as a QR code and in the description. Thanks again, and see you next week.